Um, Thanks everybody for for joining us tonight. Um, Tonight, of course, we the meeting is timed closest to the equinox, and the papers. I hope everybody got a chance to read the papers. I think they're two fantastic papers. The first one I've read countless times in different classes. It always seems to be week one required reading. The second paper was a recent publication. I think Kim was one of the peer reviewers on it before it came out. And I guess if you guys, without further ado, we can jump right into it. I'm gonna share out my screen. And there again, just the papers, Ruggles, 1997, Who's Equinox? You know, which of course I think is a groundbreaking and very important paper if you're going to be doing any kind of work in the field. So let me minimize this for a second. I just wanted to bring out two things here from the beginning of his paper. Clive says, the concept of the equinox has a precise meaning within the framework of Greek geometrical astronomy that underlines the Western scientific tradition. For us, the two equinoxes are defined in terms of the tilt of the Earth with respect to the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. Alternatively, they can be understood in terms of the places where and the times when the apparent path of the sun against the fixed stars, the ecliptic, crosses the celestial equator at the declination of 0 degrees. But from the perspective of a totally different worldview, devoid of these underlying geometrical concepts, finding an explanation of our equinox would be far from simple and possibly could make no sense at all. So what he's basically saying here, the gist of his argument is the equinox, our concept of the equinox comes from a Western tradition that was developed by Greek philosophy and Greek astronomers and passed on through cultures in the Middle East and eventually, you know, the rest of the Western world. But without that kind of history or contextual background, the equinox really does not have, or he questions what importance the equinox might have in a worldview that's separate from that tradition. And he claims that when equinoctial alignments are found within the archaeological record, or at least not found but proposed, they conform to one of four different methods of measurement or ideas or proposals. The first one he talks about, and I call these pseudo equinoxes. I mean, of course, they're not really, or the argument is that they're not really aligned to the equinox. But the first one he talks about is finding the spatial midpoint between the rising or the setting position of the sun at the two solstices. So the argument here is that ancient people knew where the winter solstice rose on the horizon. They knew where the summer solstice rose on the horizon. And architectural alignments are claimed to point to the midpoint between those two points. So first of all, you know, we're dealing with declination. And declination is calculated, like we talked before, from the polar azimuth, your latitude, and your horizon altitude. So this only comes out to 0 if your horizon altitude is completely flat, level, like it would be at sea. Otherwise, you're going to be several degrees away from that. And coming up with that would involve, taking those two positions and dividing them in half, and you would have to have a well-calibrated device to even begin to measure those angles. And the last question is, why would people even do that? What motivation would they have? What could this even mean in their worldview? Just trying to find a midpoint on a horizon between solstices.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
Second bullet point. So is this in terms of like the angle between where you are and where the sun is rising on the ground? So then if that's what you're trying to bisect, you can do that with a compass. Like you don't need a well-calibrated instrument, if I'm do you know what I mean?
Right, but the compass was invented in China, I believe.
I mean, can't you just do it with like a string on a stick?
Well, I mean, you're good. The better precision you're going to have is from a far horizon, right? So I don't think that's going to work, because you're going to have your observation point, right? And then you're going to have a point on the horizon, which is going to be your winter solstice, sunrise on the horizon in the south. And then you're going to have your summer solstice, sunrise in the north. And then to find the exact position of the center would be a difficult endeavor, because remember, the solstice means standstill. So one of the difficulties in finding the solstice position is that it kind of hangs out there for a couple days, right? So finding the exact position is difficult.
So because you're measuring things that are so far away on your horizon,
Right.
And then there's like a little bit, there's a margin of error on both sides of where your angle would be. You can't just like bisect it.
A good
Makes
experiment, since we're so close to the equinox, is go out in the morning and look at the sunrise and then compare it tomorrow. Because if you're looking at the summer solstice or around the winter solstice, it'll rise around the same place. But right now, at this time of the year, it swings very fast. So the sunrise today will be very different from the sunrise tomorrow. So
that would require me getting up before sunrise.
it will. And trust me, you're going to have to do that a lot.
Hey, Chris, I have a comment also, if you
Sure.
don't mind. So you keep using this term exact, and so you're like describing what it would take to find an exact, location.
Right. Yep.
I guess why would anybody want to know exactly? I mean, that's a
great question. That's a great question.
I mean, if you think of an equinox as a time of year, so we think of the precision of astronomy, it's that moment, that exact moment that this crosses the equator and all that stuff. But if you're just sort of thinking, kind of in general, this is that time of year that the sun is, kind of over towards the east. It doesn't matter if you're off a day or two, or a degree or two, or whatever or two. I'm not sure why your thing kind of calls for it to be exact.
Sure, that's a great question. If you don't mind, can we address that at the end?
Oh, sure.
Because that's a very, very key point in Sprock's closing arguments. But does it anything else before I jump to a next slide? So the next one that Ruggles talks about is finding the halfway point in time between the two solstices and architectural alignments, which might align up to the sunrise on the horizon on the day which is halfway between winter solstice and summer solstice. This will produce declinations generally above 0 degrees, which means they're going to be a little bit you know, a little bit above, or a little bit below, I'm sorry, above 90 degrees really, because we're looking towards the east for this. Theoretically, we're looking towards the east. We're going to see that might change. And this would involve actually the counting of the number of days between the solstices and having the difference. So Ruggles says this presupposes a level of numeracy sufficient to count, record, recall, and manipulate numbers up to at least 183, and that the solstices themselves have already been determined accurately to the day, which cannot be achieved by direct observation. So what he means by this is if you're looking to see the furthest south the sun will travel on when it reaches the winter solstice, it's imperceptible to the human eye. It just can't be viewed that way. So there needs to be another method. And we've talked about some historic Pueblo methods in the past couple months about how they would have found the solstices by starting way early and then counting days. Successive generations would count days from a horizon point and tie knots or untie knots, till the solstice and came back to the same position. And then, with historical knowledge, they were able to determine where the solstice was or when it was based upon their horizon calendar. So to find that and see, I spelled have wrong, but to find that and to determine the day between those, Ruggles says it has its own problems. What we're going to see actually is this is the exact target that Sprock is talking about when he talks about quarter days in the next paper. But this is also one of the four what I'll call pseudo equinoxes that Ruggles talks about people assuming that the orientation is pointed to. The third one that he talks about is finding the day on which the sun rises and the sun sets in exactly the opposite directions. And it's dependent upon the horizon altitudes in the east and west, of course, because we've already talked about that's how our declination is. We come by it. He says this is arguably the simplest because you could have two sighting sticks and you could measure it from east to west, or I'm sorry, west to east in the morning, and then just in the evening you look the opposite direction and you could see when those two dates line up. I would argue that this is really more, we would think of this as cardinal directions. If we saw this kind of alignment in the field, we would probably be better to interpret that orientation as to the cardinal directions instead of to the equinox. And then the last one is equal day and equal night. This one is the least likely. As it will require devices capable of measuring periods of time. So just because we could find an exact point of sunrise and sunset before the invention of watches or timekeeping devices, that went down to the minute level, this is highly unlikely. So,
Chris,
yes,
may I
please.
make a comment? May I make a comment there?
Yes, please.
Even the word equinox is wrong, isn't it? Because of refraction of the sun above the horizon. Even on the exact day of equinox, it's not equal day and equal night because the sun has already risen a few days earlier because of apparently due to refraction. So that on the day of equinox, you have more sunlight than darkness. So
Right.
the word, this would happen if we were on the moon and there was no atmosphere, then the term or idea of equinox would work. But on the Earth, it just doesn't work because of refraction. And I suppose people developed that term before they knew anything about refraction, of course, and before they made accurate times of daytime and nighttime at the time of equinox. They just imagined that's the way it would be. So even that is an illusion.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we actually started our very first journal club meeting with a paper that you and Andy Monroe did on methodology at Pueblo Bonito, and how that site was erroneously stated to be oriented to the equinox, or at least the one wall.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And
in spite of various claims to the contrary.
Right. And you guys were able to provide photographic evidence that was just not the case.
Yeah. Which it was wishful thinking.
Right. But a great example of orientation to the cardinal directions.
Yeah, and the orientation cardinal directions is interesting because if you one can determine true north through shadow casting by a gnomon.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've used that and built a rectangular or a square building, then the other sides are indeed going to be facing east and west. But it has nothing to do with any astronomical observation. It's entirely architectural.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think Belmonte hit on that point when he was talking about the Egyptian pyramids in his paper that just came out last year in the collection in honor of Ruggles. That was called What Equinox? It's also a very good paper. He uses some of the statistical analysis that we looked at in Fabio's paper a couple of months back to clearly eliminate thoughts of orientation to the equinox, even in Ptolemaic Egypt, which was under the influence of the Greeks, who knew very well of the equinox because it was their word. Anybody else have any impressions of or what they thought about the first paper? I hope people got to read it. Or
well, I think may I did make a comment with that solstices make sense, especially winter solstice, when the world is when the sun has changed its direction, as well as summer, but winter in particular. But there's no particular reason at all to be interested in equinox, and to attempt to determine its location when the sun is traveling very fast is just a fool's errand. Especially when you have a variation of altitudes along a horizon. It doesn't mean anything.
right. Any other thoughts maybe about Ruggles before we move on to the next paper?
I guess in response to Kim, it does seem interesting though that the day and night are approximately equal lengths. Like maybe where the astronomically creating an alignment to commemorate that isn't that interesting, but I think the like timing of that day and night is interesting, even if it's approximate.
It is probably for us, Al,
It's
but
interesting to me.
yeah, the closer you get to the equator, the closer that is almost every day, right? So it would be, I think exponentially more difficult for somebody like the Maya who are living, around, 17 degrees north. Yeah, because when you get down there, it's light at 6 a.m. and it's dark at 6 p.m. In the summer.
I think Mary was trying to say something.
Hey, Mary.
We can't hear you.
I think your mic might be.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah, now I can.
Okay.
Now we could.
When I spend a lot of time in Sankoe, I go up there and pray, and I'm there at sunrise. I'm there in the spring, the winter, in the fall, and on one, it's orientated east to west, with the tip of it facing due east. So there's a sun marker there. And then on the west side, there's a horizon marker that a lot of people just walk by because they think it's a natural, where they chipped away at the stone at the tufa, and it leaves a horizon mark. And if you turn around and you look, you see that horizon. And I was up there, that's where I sit. And during the equinox, which is coming, planting time was important because it's based on that. So in that same scene where that horizon marker is, there's also a scene of planting the gardens, and it's a big cornfield, and there's a lot of stories about that cornfield that's on that rock as well. But that's what I've seen from just being around the rock art up in Bandelier and Sankoe, and that's Keris, by the way. And in Santa Clara, there's no, I haven't found one yet, but we're kind of orientated different on our sites. Was I off to the left side on that?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, certainly orientation to the east and due east is a very important cosmological principle. I wonder if that's what that horizon marker marks, because we can so easily conflate the two. I don't know. I was last year at this time. I was in Arizona, and I went to a place called Shaw Butte, north of Arizona, and I remeasured some stuff that Todd Bostwick had measured, and he had written about some rock art that he thought that aligned to the rising or the solstitial equinox. So I went out there and I measured it, and then the next day I was the equinox sunrise, and I got the photographs, and in fact that was the second slide. The background picture was that equinox sunrise. You can see it kind of aligns to the rock art, but it brings back to the question of why would that have been important? I mean, I just did it to remeasure some of Bostwick's work, but it seems to be there. But as we'll see in the Sprock article, even well measured things might have better answers to them than a Western concept of equinox. Kim, do you have any maybe additions to that? I mean, I certainly.
Oh, I think it's so common. For example, in India, most of the temples are oriented east-west, but it's not astronomical. It's the cardinal orientation idea of a rectangular building is oriented north-south, and that north-south orientation is very important for creating a ritual structure that works for the Hindus. But the opening to the east is simply because that's where the day starts, and every day of the year, the sun starts somewhere off in the east, and that's sort of a version of the creation of the world. You know, every morning you get a new world that is created. I think it's important to face things. You know, Navajo Hogans are oriented to the east, but I don't think there's an attempt to make it very precise or to make it an astronomical sighting. So Mary, where did you say you saw a horizon marker? Was that in Bandelier?
In Tsangkawe.
Oh, Sankawi.
Yeah, and Bandelier has one, but you have to kind of be there at the right time, or you won't.
Even down in the canyon or up above?
Yeah, you won't notice it.
Yeah.
Because the sun stays, you know, and just kind of goes all the way across.
Mhm.
So it's timing when you're in that one, but at Tsangkawe it's obvious. Do you know where Tsangkawe is?
Oh, yes. Mhm.
By White Rock?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, in Bandelier, of course, there's this shrine of the stone lions up on the canyon. That conceivably you could see the sun rising close to east on equinox, but I don't know of any alignment on the tops of the canyons at Bandelier.
You know where the Longhouse area is?
Down in the canyon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it starts there. But like I said, if you don't, there's sun symbol, and then there's the sunrise symbol, and then the other one for sunset. And it's just a really faded glyph. I mean, it's way up on the top, like on the walls. And a lot of people, they see it, and I'm not sure. There's another story about the twin war gods that it's close by it as well. I would have to take you out there and point
Well,
it.
that's very interesting. This is Sankawi, did you say, or
In Bandelier, Tsangkawe
Bandelier.
has this face of glyphs to the west, and then on the east it has another one with an arrow, like a regular arrow marker pointing directly to a sun symbol.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't notice it, you know, they just, it's not very big, I guess. So I guess you really don't pay attention.
Well, I've walked Sankawi very often. I haven't seen it. There you go.
Yeah, yeah, or they're not seeing where the reduction, and then it's the exact outline of the horizon line. And if you turn around, you'll see that horizon. I watched even the eclipse of the sun from there.
Mhm.
But anyway, we'll have to make a field trip for you.
Yes, yes.
All right, I'm going to share out my screen again, and you're right. I forgot about this one. Here's a quick slide, of course, from the Ruggles paper, where he talks about these different types of pseudo equinoxes on the horizon, where he talks about true east lining up to 90 degrees, the spatial midpoint on his diagram here between the winter solstice and the summer solstice is way off from 90 degrees. And the temporal midpoint, the time between
They
the
can,
winter and the solstice in the number of days is just to the north of 90 degrees, which is a great diagram, which shows us how different all of these things really are. So that brings us to a Sprock's paper, which I really like. Here's 3 or 4 sentences that I think sum up what we do really well, and I wanted to just put them on here, so that we can look at them together. I think these are extremely important concepts here. And I'll just go ahead and read it. For any architectural orientation or alignment identified in an archaeological context, it is relatively easy to find an astronomical correlate, but to propose with a reasonable degree of confidence that the observed correspondence is not fortuitous, we need either independent contextual evidence suggesting an astronomical motive for the alignment in question, iconography, written sources, etc., or a statistically significant number of comparable alignments incorporated into a coherent or homogeneous set of archaeological features, the same type and pertaining to the same cultural complex, corresponding to the same declination, or both. So unbelievably, that is one sentence. I got through it, and there's a lot of stuff in there. A lot of stuff that we've already talked about since the beginning of Journal Club. If you're going to suggest an astronomical correspondence to your alignment, it's iconography is of course always important. Written sources, ethnographic reports. Remember another one of Ruggles' statements from another paper is one word of an ethnography is worth 1,000 alignments.
That's right.
And if you don't have any of that, which a lot of times we don't have it, they don't have it where Ruggles works in Europe, England and Ireland. In that case, we're looking for a statistically significant number of comparable alignments and alignment groups. And without that, it's really tough. And then he goes on to say, on the other hand, the meaning of an alignment or a coherent set of alignments with the same astronomical referent can be properly understood only if we manage to find the reason for which the postulated astronomical phenomenon could have been significant to the society that produced the alignments. The viability of an archaeoastronomical hypothesis is directly proportional to the degree of significance that can be assigned to the astronomical phenomena involved. And there we can look at seasonal change, subsistence strategy, religion, political ideology. Basically, perhaps pointing to the start of the symbolic or idealized start of a rainy season, things like that. So there's a lot to unpack in these 3 or 4 long and wieldy sentences, but I think that really the lessons in just these few sentences can't be understated. So Sprock talks about 5 different methodological flaws which people in studying Mesoamerica make when they talk about alignments to the equinoxes. And the first one he mentions is the E group at Washington. And I can talk about this a little bit if people aren't as familiar with E groups. because it might be outside of, their,
It might be worth mentioning.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the bottom picture on the left is a drawing that was done for the proposed E group at Washington. Now, what they call an E group is typically a ceremonial plaza that's a raised plaza. And on the western edge of the plaza, there's usually a radial pyramid. And then on the eastern side of the plaza, there's a long platform. And if it's just the radial temple and the platform, that's typically called a cenote style E group. A cenote style E group will have a larger, superstructure in the middle, maybe two smaller ones built, on the wings. But the other type is called the Washington type, and that's what's represented here with three temples arrayed in a roughly north-south line on the eastern edge of the ceremonial platform. So back in 1928, Ricketson and some others, when they were excavating Washington, they noticed that, when the, from a place upon the radial pyramid, the sunrise for the winter solstice would come over the southernmost temple on the eastern side. The equinox would come over the central pyramid, and the summer solstice would rise over the northern. And this was met with wild acclaim. Carnegie Institute threw a whole lot of money at it then, and lots of exploration was funded by this discovery, and it kind of kicked off the whole the Maya were just astronomers that Thompson later really latched onto and said that the glyphs only related to astronomy, things like that. But then within the next couple of years, 90 more E groups were discovered, and they did not conform to this. I mean, they still had the western radial pyramid, and they still had the three temples on the eastern side of the plaza, but they did not line up to the winter solstice, the equinox, and the summer solstice. So that caused a lot of people to say, well, why does it work at Washington and nowhere else? And then the next big theory was, well, Washington was a functional observatory, and all these others came after, and they were just mimicking the structure, but they lost the functionality. And that was a great theory, except then it was found that Washington wasn't the first by far. It was just one among many, and almost every polity in the Maya lowlands had one of these structures built in the pre-classic period. So there's been 100 years of research on E groups, and most of it was really, really wrong until maybe just a couple years ago. And it was Ivan Sprach who has a great paper on the E groups. So what's more, you might say, well, then why does it work in Washington and nowhere else? And the answer is it never worked at Washington. So what we're looking at here in this drawing works great on paper, but this was never a reality because the construction phases of these temples never lined up properly to allow this kind of viewing. So Mark and I were just talking about a volume that we're going to both be in that's coming out, and Ivan Sprach has a new paper in that talking about how Washington was never functional because of the different architectural phases. so when he took all these, and he went through Mexico, and I don't think he went into Belize, but he went to the rest of the lowlands, and he measured, I think, 78 E groups, and the declinations that he calculated are laid out here on this this chart on the bottom right. And if there was an orientation to the equinox, of course, it would show up at 0 degrees, and you can see here that there is really no peak that aligns to a declination of 0 degrees, which says these temples really did not line up to the equinox at all. Now, they do line up to other things, and these other things are astronomical, and they are important, but they're not the equinox. They're based upon important dates, and those dates appear at intervals of either 13 or 20 days, which are key dates in the Maya calendar. But you'll notice these little tiny bumps here at negative. Well, it's not -1 and 1, but it's actually negative 0.08 and 0.08. You see those first two little bumps. So if you would view not the equinoctial sunrise, but the sunset from the center pyramid on the east over top of the radial period in the west, the opposite direction, it sets on the date of March 22nd, which is the temporal midpoint between the solstices. And Dr. Sprock calls this the quarter days. So he's using that day to divide the year into quarters, from the solstice to the quarter day to the other solstice, and back again. And that's what he interprets this little hump at. His research shows that there's nothing could be said about the side of the line of sight between the northern and the southern temples, that they have likely no astronomical import. Some of them aren't even within the range of the solstices. Some of them are longer. But his argument is that the line of sight from here, what would be E2 back to E7 sub, is the true alignment, and it points not to the solstice not to the equinox sunrise, but to the quarter day sunset. And that's basically his argument about the E groups. Is there any question on that? I'm not saying do you question him. I'm saying, is there anybody have any questions that I might be able to?
Doesn't he also say that some of the E groups are aligned to the solstice? Did I misread?
Well, okay, so no, not really, because you can see that in the actual declination chart below, right? Because if it was, we might have this little bump here on the very edge, but that's even above 23. So not really, no.
Yeah, that was my next question, was how you saw that in the graph, if so.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thanks.
no. What he's looking at is important agricultural dates, and that these dates may be separated by periods of 20 or 13 days in the calendar, just like we talked about in the historic Pueblo papers, where there was anticipatory observations, so that they weren't looking at the sunrise on the winter solstice per se. They were looking at a sunrise that happened before the winter solstice, so they had ample time to plan their ceremonies. This is almost the same kind of thing. You know, if the day is separated by 13 or 20 days, 20 days later, the same date of the month would arrive, or 13 days later, the same Tzolk'in day sign would show up. So it was kind of in sync with their Tzolk'in ritual calendar and their Hob 365 day calendar, which was actually also a ritual calendar, not.
So Chris, could I make
Sure.
a comment about anticipatory? Maybe you know my feelings about that. Namely, 2 weeks, the observation be 2 weeks before solstice, besides giving you 2 weeks of preparation, also identifies a period of the moon, of the sidereal, of the solstitial moon, and that means that for the Zunis, as you know, the important celebration was not solstice itself, but the full moon closest to solstice. So that if you identify a date 2 weeks before solstice, then you know that the next full moon during a 4-week period, either before or after solstice, is going to be the full moon closest to solstice. And that is the time for celebration, which was for the Zuni. So I'm not too much of a fan on the idea of anticipation, but I think the idea of setting up a device which tells you when the full moon is going to be close to solstice is consistent in terms of ethnography from the Zunis,
Yeah.
and it's something we find many places in the ancestral pueblos. 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after solstice is a marker in many places. So two alternative hypotheses. One anticipation,
Yeah, that's a great point.
and the other is the full moon at solstice.
I think there might be a paper in that, Kim. Whose anticipatory observation, maybe?
Right. Well, in terms of getting back to India, the full moon is an important time for any kind of solstice, any kind of event, because that gives you light throughout the day, throughout the night, I mean. And it also, for 2 weeks before that, is the light, the bright portion of the moon, such that people can walk into the site throughout the evening and part of the night. So I think a full moon festival is a really good time for holding a gathering. It's something that's easy to determine time-wise, because everyone can determine when from a full moon as opposed to when solstice is itself. Anyhow.
Yeah, that's a great point. So moving along here, Sprague talks about a second type of methodological flaw, where the alignment or the observational scheme proposed has no support in the material evidence. And he gives two good examples here. One is the Temple of the Seven Dolls, which is pretty big in popular consciousness as an archaeoastronomical tourist destination where people come to watch the equinox sunrise through, two of the four doorways in the Temple of the Seven Dolls. And you can see a picture down there that I was given of just one, such event. But in measuring it, Sprague has found out that it's actually skewed to 1 degree. And if you view it in the opposite direction, again, well, first of all, the people that show up, if you show up to watch it, if you look head on during the equinox, the sun does not rise through the doorway. You have to actually offset yourself to see the view. And second, he measured it in the opposite direction, and he found again that the sunset on the quarter day of March 22nd was much more accurate, and it seemed to represent the only conceivable significant target. Another popular one that's talked about with no archaeological support, but you might say it has, some pseudo-historical support, is the Temple Mayor at Tenochtitlan, which of course is no longer there for us to measure. It's underneath downtown Mexico City. But Modolino wrote that the feast that he witnessed fell at the same time as the equinox. Now, so this was all based upon, one of the Spanish chroniclers saying that their feast was timed to the equinox, and the sun between the two temples at the top. But what Sprock talks about is in the Middle Ages, when these people were writing, they didn't really talk about the equinox in the same way that we talked about the equinox, where the declination of the sun is 0 degrees. Their definition of the equinox was the Feast of Annunciation, which was around the time of the vernal equinox, but it was not the same thing. And the vernal equinox really didn't have the same import as the feasts did, and the feasts were what would have been referenced and not any astronomical concept. Is there anybody have anything there before I plot on? His third methodological flaw is interpretations based on deficient or erroneous alignment data. And he talks about here 9N81, 9N83 at Copan in Honduras. And a map here of the site shows 81 here and 83 over here. He talks about that this measurement does not take into account the fact that given the altitudes of the eastern and western horizons, more than 6 degrees and 2 degrees respectively, the alignment corresponds to neither sunrises nor sunsets of the equinox. Yet it may have been intended to record sunsets of the quarter days. So this goes back to what we said at the beginning. If you're not taking into your horizon altitude, you're not going to come up with proper declinations, and that methodological flaw can lead you to erroneous conclusions. This fourth one is he talks about basically interpretations from subjective data. And he talks about paper written by Mendez and Barnhart and several others that worked on this at the Temple of the Sun in Palenque. And you can see from the diagram that they published, they had all kinds of alignments they proposed on this one temple to the equinox and the zenith, the nadir, and lunar standstills, all in this one magical temple. And he says here that none of the dates most commonly recorded by axial orientations in the Maya area appear among the astronomical reference of these alignments, raises the suspicion that their selection was not objective, encompassing all possible visual lines, but guided by the prejudices about the importance of certain phenomena. And then he says, besides as shown elsewhere, the data provided for some of the alignments discussed do not correspond to reality. So that's a pretty scathing review, but the the proposal that they made were pretty pretty fantastic. You know, as such, you know, here you can see their, you know, what their equinox alignment was, you know, this line across the floor. But they had lines across the floor kind of going to everything. Let's see, stuck here. The fifth methodological flaw that he talks about is alternative interpretations. These are when the proposals are based on reliable alignment data, but the cases are rather exceptional, and in light of contextual comparative data, the purpose of recording the equinoxes is less likely than other explanations. Meaning, good field work was done, and the field work really did point to equinoctial sunrises. But is that really what's going on? And he gives a couple examples here of the Templo de la Caritas and Alta Vista, which is in Mexico. Vini and others suggested the actual placement of Alta Vista right up by the line of the tropics. It was chosen for its equinoctial alignment of you know, the surrounding mountainsides. And then the other one that he talks about is the temples of Tikal, which are pretty magnificent. There's 5 temples there that are just poking up out of the jungle canopy. And he talks about how proposed that temples 1 and 3 are almost exactly true east, but when you look at, he's talking here, when you look at Temple 5 to Temple 3, I believe, no, Temple 4 to Temple 3, that aligns to the December solstice. And in reality, Temple 3 and Temple 1 align to the quarter days, which is pretty much what his argument is for most of this stuff, which it seems to be. And then he lastly, he pulls the example here, which is the most famous example of acclaimed equinox alignment in all of Mesoamerica, and that's the light and shadow phenomena of El Castillo and Chichen Itza. And he talks about here how you know, the number of triangles in the snake's head changes from 6 to 9, depending on when you look at it. How the dates of the photographs show that it starts before the equinox and it goes to well after. And we talked about how quickly the sun is moving during the time of the equinox. So this could never be used to point to a date or used as a calendar of any type. I'm of the opinion that there's a lot of cosmology built into this structure. Sprock says the prudent conclusion would be that this light shadow effect is purely accidental. I don't think I agree with that at all. I think it was intentional, but I don't think it was based upon any type of calendaring. That's my own opinion. I think I base my opinion about the heads at the bottom of that one stairwell, the serpent heads. But you know, it could go either way. I mean, Carlson talks about how this pyramid is just part of a larger Venus complex, which you can't see it on here, but there's a Venus altar at the bottom of this, which has a processional to the cenote and other structures. And then, of course, it's a one, you know, any kind of time you have a one-off like this, you have to be skeptical, especially since there's another similar Venus complex just like it with the radial pyramid and the cenote and the causeway and the altar at the same site. It just doesn't share the same orientation or does not have a light shadow phenomena like this one does. So, you know, I'm certainly willing to Not willing, but I'd love to hear everybody else's opinions. I'm sure everybody knows of this site.
I had a question. I had a question.
Sure.
Is you mentioned in the text, is the serpent head, is that of the same time period as the temple? Is it significantly after, or does anyone know?
The serpent head, which can be seen, down here at the bottom, is certainly part of the balustrade. It's part of the rest of the temple. The same construction phase for sure.
I having been there, but not on the equinox. That's what I remembered, but it has been since 2003 that I was there.
One lighthearted comment is that it's kind to the visitor because you don't need to be there on exactly the day of equinox to see the event. You can be 2 or 3 days off and experience it. I think Nancy and I saw it 2 or 3 days after equinox, and we were very pleased. And in fact, it's even better because there's fewer people there.
Right. And his photographs here even range from March 15th to April 12th. What's your opinion, Kim? Do you think it's fortuitous, or do you think it was architected?
Oh, I think it's I think it's accidental, but I think it's intentional in terms of illuminating the serpent. And I think that's a very dramatic architectural.
That's what I meant. I think
device.
I think the light and shadow effect of illuminating the serpent was intentional, but I don't think it has anything to do with the equinox or calendaring in any way.
And it moves too.
Right. Almost in the same kind of way as the Temple of Abu Simbel, where the sun illuminates the 3 of the 4 gods in the back of the temple and leaves Thoth in the dark. I believe that was intentional, but you hear crazy theories like that was done on Ramses' birthday, which of course his birthday would have been in the civil calendar, which drifted, because it didn't align at all with the tropical.
Well, it is neat that Nut, I guess, the god of the underworld, is never illuminated. So that's very thoughtful on your part.
Yeah, and it's great, and I don't think it could possibly be accidental, but I don't think it was calendared either. Is my opinion.
We don't know.
Right. Let me jump over here. For some reason.
Chris,
Yes.
the number of triangles, they're sacred numbers. 9 and 7, I think.
Well, yeah. Well, what they say is 9 and 6 together means 13, and 13 is a sacred number to the Maya. There's 13 coefficients in the Tzolk'in calendar, and with 9 there's 9 levels of Xibalba, the underworld.
Yeah.
And of course there's 13 levels of the sky, 7 levels of the earth. So that's a point that Sprock makes too. If it's going for numerology, which wouldn't be out of character for the Maya at all, 9 might be the more appropriate, which is even further from the equinox, the 12th of April or beyond. And of course, serpents are iconographically linked to the underworld, but at the same time, the Maya word for serpent is Khan, and the Maya word for sky is also Khan. So in the glyphs, serpents and sky can also often be used interchangeably in cute little ways, and that was perfectly normal for them. They would understand if they saw a snake in a context that was kind of celestial. They would say, "Oh, I'm supposed to read this as sky." So there could be something to that for sure.
But oops.
Oh, and
You're
now
muted again, Ray.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. He also is a feathered serpent, which is a winged watered serpent.
mhm.
So I could see him representing both sky and underworld.
Right. It's in the Yucatan, it was Kukulkan.
Yeah, Kukulkan was
Kukulkan
also
is the Yucatecan equivalent of the Toltec Quetzalcoatl.
Quetzalcoatl, yeah.
who
And
has,
here it's a Vanyu, we have a Vanyu here, which
so
represents the same thing.
there are the attributes the same? Of course,
Yeah.
of course,
The
Venus
wing.
is very, very much tied to it, and wind.
If you're going to talk about Quetzalcoatl, you might think about what stars are overhead when the sun rises.
Well, that's your realm, Mark. I wouldn't.
It's a possibility they're related. And just for those of you that know me, that the humpback is overhead during this time period. Maybe just a coincidence.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that, Mark?
The humpback, the one that I associate with Quetzalcoatl,
Oh yes.
is overhead at dawn during this time period.
During the time of the vernal equinox.
Yeah, from March to April there. So you would have the star that's tied to Quetzalcoatl, and then you would have the snake during the sun. It seems like an obvious tie to me.
Yeah, could be.
Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's pretty much all I had. A couple final thoughts that I'd want to leave is Ruggles' statement that said it would probably be helpful if the word equinox were simply eliminated from the archaeoastronomer's vocabulary. That's his conclusion. Sprock says the analysis of large samples of alignment data have revealed the existence of various orientation groups, most of which were recorded sunrises and sunsets on agriculturally significant days, where the declinations marked by one prominent group are concentrated near the value of 1 degree of declination, corresponding to the quarter days of the year. The absence of any clustering around the equinoctial value of 0 degrees makes the existence of orientations targeting the true equinox utterly unlikely. And then from us, it's happy quarter day, March 22nd, 2022.
Hooray.
Couple other good papers that are in a similar vein, if anybody's interested, is Belmonte's What Equinox that came out recently in the Advancing Cultural Astronomy edited edition. A paper he jointly wrote with Gonzalez Garcia called Which Equinox? Ruggles' recap after the journal's Skyscape Archaeology reprinted the article we discussed tonight is still our equinox, and then Sprock and Sanchez Nava's earlier work that this would build on, equinoxes in Mesoamerican architectural alignments, reality or modern myth. So that's all I prepared. I'd certainly like to open it up now, for more general discussion. If anybody has anything else that they'd like to share, I'm essentially tapped out.
Thank you.
Another nice equinox event is Angkor Wat in Cambodia, where the temple has been rotated very, very slightly, so that when you stand on the a main ceremonial pathway in the center of that at equinox, then you see the sun rising up over the top of the temple.
I would like to ask you about that, Kim. There seems to be a lot of legitimate equinoctial alignments in that part of the country. I mean, part of the world. India, Cambodia, are they true equinox alignments? I mean, I believe that ethnographic data has, or ethnographic sources talk about that this was a concept they were familiar with, that it was part of their worldview. Is that true?
We really don't have any data on that, but the other temples of the same Khmer rule are also rotated. So there's a whole series of temples that have been slightly rotated, depending on whether they're east facing or west facing. So it does seem as though they were interested in that event. But again, it is wonderful for the tourist agencies, because the sunrise coming up over Angkor Wat is has converted a very nice, quiet, serene place to a madhouse of 2,000 or 3,000 people who try to get a view of the sun coming up over the top of the temple.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but a National Geographic special, and if you have Disney Plus, you can see it. It's called Chasing the Equinox, and it has as one of its main people Fabio Silva, and therefore Forsini's in that, and Tori's in that, who just got his PhD this week. And it's interesting. I think they have, in talking to Fabio, you know, they were pretty concerned about the whole premise, and they shot their pieces, and then of course, doesn't matter what they say because they put a narrator on top of it to interpret whatever they said and fit the narrative. But it's certainly interesting. You know, you'll see sites like Angkor Wat and Tori's work at Malta and some other places.
Tori's great temple, Nidra, at Malta, you know, marks the summer and winter very precisely. And it goes from one side to the other side, and equinox is in the middle. So that there's no real astronomical event that you can see from that temple that is associated with equinox, but it's halfway in between, like so many of these other.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing about Angkor Wat is that temple is facing west rather than east. So it is a real anomaly in terms of traditional Hindu temples.
And of course, a lot of that too is timed by lunar phases as well, right? A lot of their ceremonies.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about a paper that you wrote about watching pilgrims along the river.
Right, in at Varanasi. Yeah, they have a very, very complicated solar lunar calendar. Yeah, that gets people to these celebrations very, very precisely, because the moon is such a good timepiece. But these celebrations in Varanasi are just people get there within a day. They've got it timed really perfectly. But the moon does that for you, as opposed to the sun. So how did you know that I was a reviewer for Sprock's paper? Did I tell you that?
Yeah, that shouldn't be public knowledge, is it? Should it be?
But anyhow, I did somersaults when I read that paper. I thought it's wonderful.
You did tell me, and then I wrote him and I said I have to have this paper, and he kindly sent it to me. So I don't have anything else. Next month, I think we're planning so far to take another detour away from the Four Corners region or from Mesoamerica, and we're thinking about looking at Hohokam astronomy. And I have two papers in mind. One of them is a society paper that we should have no problem. The other one We just have to get through the logistics of how we make it available, because it's not public access. So we'll see where we land on that, and maybe, you know, if there's something else that we can pair it up with. But Chris, Rick, I don't know if anybody has anything else that they would like to talk about, or
I just want to say, yeah, Chris has sent me the next few months, and I'm really trying to get caught up. So I'll try to get everything on the webpage and get the announcements out sooner, and hopefully get ahead of the papers so you have them a little bit more time to read them before the meeting.
These
So,
are
yeah,
very
we're-
interesting papers, and thank you, Chris, for bringing them to the table. So,
Oh, my pleasure. I hope people enjoyed these papers. I think the Ruggles paper is extremely important, and I think Sprock's paper really captures a lot of important concepts, which he then uses to make his point. But he circles back, and I just, you know, I didn't include it, but I highlighted it in my paper, in my copy. I just think was probably that important. He says, since the directions of the equinox and the quarter day sunrise differ by less than a degree, what might the significance of accurately determining the intended target? This goes back to what you were asking earlier, Rick.
Right.
An incorrect interpretation gives a false insight into the cognitive world of the society involved. Without taking into account hard data by defining the alignment targets as equinoxes, many scholars have indulged in unproductive, ethnocentric, and sweeping generalizations concerning the astronomical concepts of ancient societies. Meaning, you know, if it's an approximation of the, like, he also mentions a paper by Vidala and Milbreth. Vidala was Susan Milbreth's last PhD student before she retired. And what he did was pretty cool. I mean, he used I forget which one. It was a gaming engine to recreate the Maya site of Saros, which is on a promontory right above the bay in northern Belize, and created an entire three-dimensional world, basically, of Saros, based upon the archaeological drawings and data during excavation. So he had different construction phases where you could put on those 3D glasses, and you could actually walk through Saros, and you could move around in this gaming edges to Saros. And he stood at this one temple, and he could see the equinox sun almost rise, and then they reported in the paper that, they just made, not some, it was close enough to be the equinox is basically the point. It was close enough, it was the equinox. They just weren't all that accurate. But Sprock's point is, well, what does that even mean? There's no, the equinox to us has a precise meaning. And if it doesn't have that meaning, what does close enough to that even mean? You know what I mean?
But it was like I was saying before, there's things don't change in nature on an exact day, right? Things happen in periods. This is the month that this happens.
Mhm.
I think it just seems to me that some of these things go too much into detail of trying to make some sort of exact relationship. I'm not sure you just have to do that. But
yeah, if your calendar,
not finding it in ethnography also is, I think is probably more important. If it just doesn't come up, then that's
right. To Sprock's point, though, if the 1 degree declination is prominent and the 0 degree is not prominent, to say that it's equinoctial is not only adding the ethnocentric kind of bent to it, but it also, you miss out on what they were really trying to get at. You know, what was really important to them. And that was just for the Maya, you know, that was calendaring. You know, if we look at, you know, we talked about earlier, Hogans, you know, that open up to the east. And, you know, that was true as well as, you know, Iron Age constructs in, you know, Europe or city layouts in the Amazon we're finding. I mean, those are directional, right? Those are towards the east. They're directional, I would say, and not calendrical. So if we're talking about an equinoctial alignment, if somebody's proposing that almost has calendrical implications. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess so, but I just I think the two bigger points is that well, in fact, even today, I was doing a little look back this week because I'm doing a presentation about this tomorrow, and it's like there's very few. There are some, but there's very few cultures that use this as the beginning of the year. So springtime is sort of a new beginning and all of that stuff. So there's a large celebration in Japan on the equinox, but it's not really the beginning of a year. Persians, ancient Persia, I think, sort of had essentially the equinox really was New Year's Day for them, and their calendar started on that day. And of course, sort of famously, the horoscope starts on the equinox, right? So the beginning,
sure,
part of Eris.
But that's so, Hellenistic, though.
What's that?
That's Hellenistic, though, right?
Yes, but what I'm saying is that some cultures have specifically target the equinox as some ceremonial thing. And so if you want to call it the first day of spring, if you want to call it in between the two solstices, however you want to kind of term it, in some places it was very important. So what were they seeing? What made that important, I think, is probably worthy of the conversation.
Sure.
That doesn't come up in this particular region or the ethnic.
Sure. And again, I would say, like, let's look at the Celtic civilization.
Yeah.
Who, you know, they might say that, you know, they divided the year into eighths, right? And they had their celebrations. But if you're going to divide it that way, that's probably counting days, right? Not looking at horizons. And if you go further south towards the equator, you no longer have 4 seasons, right? Now you have 2 seasons. You have rainy season and dry season. And spring has no meaning anymore, you know, when you get, you know.
That's true. And that's it was interesting in Sprock's paper too, so just the comparison of the region. So yeah, there's basically the Mediterranean temperate zones are going to be the places that have 4 seasons. And so their celebrations, their ritual cycles and things like that naturally would kind of be expressed that way, I think, as opposed to on the equator. So
yeah, and there were lots of Kim, were you at Efrosini's lecture for the Skyscape Archaeology keynotes? No, I think she discussed Greek equinox festivals at the beginning of spring too, which are they're a real thing, right?
But those were probably counting the days, as you mentioned.
Could be, or it could be that the Greeks, the equinox, you know, the title of the first paper is Whose Equinox, right? It's not to say that there's no equinox or nobody knew it, but the Greeks certainly did, right? So if the Greeks knew it, I wouldn't say it's a stretch to say the Persians did, right? Because they may not have been friends, but there were certainly cultural contact.
Or maybe it began more in the sort of Babylonian, Mesopotamian kind of region. That would sort of make more sense to me. A lot of seems like this would predate classic Greek culture. I don't know. It seems to me that I would. Don't know where I got that. But so anyway, but yeah, and it could have just been, I don't know if it's a day count or an awareness that at a certain time of year, it's not so cold anymore and we're about to start planting and
Oh, absolutely.
let's get excited about stuff, you know, and so.
Yeah, that's absolutely, but that's a totally different concept than the equinox stuff, right?
So in fact, I think the original spring break, you know, was like, they were going to Lake Havasu just, you know, 3,000 years ago.
That could be.
Instead of going to Florida, they went to Lake Havasu.
Long before there was a Lake Havasu, apparently. So anyway, yes, but you know, the beginning, in fact, in the Japanese festival, this is what they did. They use the time. It's a traditionally sort of they clean up the graves, right? So you go visit your cemeteries and sort of like just kind of refreshen and sort of, you know, make the flowers work and all that stuff. And this whole notion of sort of new beginnings and spring cleaning and, you know, kind of all that kind of stuff is sort of naturally around this cycle. And just because the conditions are right for that to happen, whether people noticed astronomically that there was something going on at the same time that was significant, who knows? But I would suspect that the welcoming back of really good weather and fertility
Oh yeah,
probably out trumps just about
and,
everything.
and they certainly noticed the sun rising further to the north. You know,
Sure, that would be done.
but
Well, I think the thing that's that gladdens my heart about Sprock's work is that it's the result of very, very careful and precise measurements. You know, he's a very, very serious worker.
Yeah.
And he was going in there with a theodolite to measure these angles very precisely. And that's nice. You know, it's
the
nice
light
to,
of machete and not much else.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you guys. I had
Thank
fun.
you so much,
I hope
Chris.
I really like these papers, and I hope you guys join us next week as we hopefully take a look at the Hohokam.
Yeah, I like that.